Bourbon 101. Here's how to choose your first bottle without breaking the bank. So getting into whiskey can be very expensive if you're not careful. And before you know it, you might be spending money on bottles that clearly are not worth it. Maybe bottles that you spent upwards of $100 or more. That happened to me. There was a bottle that I bought that was a $100-something bottle, and I was very excited. I had a big achievement in my own personal life that I was trying to celebrate. I thought maybe I'd spend a little bit more, get a nicer bottle. That was not the case. That bottle was terrible. Then there was another bottle that I spent $40 on, and that bottle was amazing. And it's still to this day one of my favorites. So here's some tips for you so that you don't make the same mistake I did back then. So first, I think when you're trying to think about which bottle you want to buy or what bottle of bourbon you need to go buy or whatever the case is, the first thing I think you need to do is identify why you are buying this bottle. That sounds so simple, but I think it's just a piece that's overlooked. If you're watching this video, maybe you already have some sort of interest in bourbon and you're interested in going out to find that bottle, or maybe you've already purchased that first bottle. But what I typically see on YouTube is just tons of content creators that make a lot of content focused on whiskey enthusiasts, and they compare this batch to this batch and blah, blah, blah. And that's all fun, and I love to nerd out about those things. But at the end of the day, if you're new to bourbon or a beginner or whatever you want to call it, or maybe just a casual drinker, some of that's irrelevant in my opinion. And the way that those people might be drinking it or enjoying their whiskey may not be how you want to enjoy it. So that may not be the right bottle for you. I think about the different pieces to my bourbon journey, and I think about, in the beginning when I just wanted to buy something that didn't taste like absolute crap. And, I'm just mixing it with a bunch of Coke anyway, and who cares, just as long as it's not terrible, as long as I can drink it. Like, that's how I started my journey. And then from there, I started going into like which whiskeys could I enjoy neat, which whiskeys I can enjoy on the rocks. And then from there, I started going into neat pours and things like that. And then even, I would say from there, I started to understand and appreciate whiskey a little bit more, to where I could go not only try things neat, but pick out nuances and different characteristics between each bottle, which then ultimately led me into doing this professionally. But either way, those bottles changed over time, and there was different things that I needed at each point, and there was things that I didn't like at each point that maybe I liked at a different point. So you have to figure out why you're even buying this bottle. What part of your bourbon journey are you even on? Do you even care about a bourbon journey? You're just looking for something good when you go out. So let's talk about each scenario and what's the best for each one. All right, the first step, bourbon to mix. So again, here's one where I just want it to be decent. I just want to mix it with something, maybe take a shot or two or whatever the case is. And even though that's not how I necessarily drink it anymore, you don't want to spend a lot of money on this thing, and you definitely don't want it to taste bad when you mix it. So two that I actually recommend quite frequently would be Maker's Mark and Jim Beam, the white label. So those two bottles you will probably see at almost any bar you ever go to. Those are just so widespread and just have mass distribution to pretty much anywhere in the world that I want to go to. If they have a bourbon there, not whiskey, not American whiskey, if they have bourbon there, they probably have one of those two bottles. So I don't think you can go wrong with those two. I think whether I'm at a baseball game or whether I'm at an airport or whether I'm out of the country, those two bottles should be available most places. And in terms of mixing and availability, I just don't think you can go wrong. If you're looking to buy the bottle, I would say either of those two are fine if you're looking to buy something to mix. But I would also throw in this Evan Williams Bottle and Bond, the white label that's sitting next to me. I think this is another one that's very cheap. I think I got this bottle for about 16 bucks, something like that, 17 bucks. And some places you can find it cheaper. I used to actually find this around $12 or $13, and I guess with all the hype, it's been marked up. But there's still people that don't necessarily like this, but everybody that I've heard say that are typically people that are trying to drink it neat. So again, if you're looking to mix something, I wouldn't spend a lot of money on it, but just because you're trying to stay within a certain budget or a certain price range does not mean you have to settle for crap. There's good whiskey even below that $20 price range. All right, next scenario. You're looking for a bottle of bourbon for cocktails. So let's say you go out to a bar and you're looking at the bourbon cocktail menu, and maybe you don't want the well bourbon there. Maybe you want something a little bit more elevated. They're probably, I would assume, going to have like an Old Forester or maybe a Benchmark from Buffalo Trace as their well bourbon. Typically, that's what I see a lot. For me personally, I like a bourbon that has a higher rye mash bill or a higher rye recipe. Mash bill is just a fancy word for the recipe basically that makes up the bourbon. The percentage of grains that are in it. So a bourbon itself has to be at least 51% or more of corn. And then the rest of that recipe, the rest of those percentages are typically made up of rye and malted barley, or wheat and malted barley, or rye and wheat and malted barley, or you could do a variety of things. but bourbon has to start with at least that 51% of corn. So if you do 51% of corn, and then let's say you do 5% of rye or 10% rye, that'd be more of a lower rye bourbon or a low rye mash bill. Typically, if you see anything that's 20% rye or over, those are typically qualified as high rye bourbons, even though that's not an actual term. That's just more of a casual term that people use to describe it. And the reason why that's important is because, especially within a cocktail, a lot of the times cocktails are made with rye whiskey instead of bourbon. And if they do use a bourbon, they want a high rye mash bill or recipe to make that cocktail, because a bourbon itself can be drowned out depending on the proof when you start mixing all these other ingredients. And you want something that balances well, plays well, but then you also want something that shines through all the other ingredients you're about to throw at it and also provides some level of character itself, something that brings quality and character to that cocktail. And the rye content within a high rye bourbon is going to help that. So when I'm out, I think, typically, again, I would say most bars, if I'm looking for something like that, or that recipe requires something with a little bit more rye content, a lot of bars actually just put a rye whiskey in there, which instead of corn being 51% or more, it would be rye that's 51% or more. So sometimes when you're out at a bar, you can't really control that. That recipe is determined by them a lot of the times, unless there's a wide range to where you can pick. Something like a Four Roses small batch would be in this category. But if you're looking to make cocktails at home, or you're just looking to kind of build your collection based on this taste profile, I would recommend starting with either something like a Four Roses small batch, or an Old Grandad Bonded, which is distilled by Jim Beam, or even a New Riff Bottled and Bond. New Riff Bottled and Bond has always been one of my favorite places, just because of the fact I got to tour it before they even started releasing their own products. So I was very excited about their products before they even bottled it. There's just something nostalgic about that brand for me. But again, when you're out somewhere at a bar and you're looking for this, Four Roses, Bullet, Old Forester, Woodford Reserve, all of these are considered high rye bourbons. So I don't think you can go wrong with those being in your cocktails. And you really can't go wrong with choosing this as your first bottle for your collection either. All right, now, if you're looking to add a bottle, or if you're looking to drink a bourbon neat, the first thing I would say is start with a lower proof, regardless of what even I say or any other channel on YouTube that you're watching that says all these things about how this is a good one and that's not a good one and blah, blah, blah. If you are somebody who traditionally mixes all your whiskey, or maybe just does shots, or whatever the case is, and you're trying to start appreciating whiskey a little bit more, or not even appreciate, you're just trying to tolerate it enough to be able to sip it neat, or sip it on the rocks without it burning too much or being overpowering, stick to a lower proof. Something like a Basil Hayden, I think, is perfect for what it is. It's something that is approachable and allows people time to kind of adjust to that proof. Something like a Basil Hayden, or even something like an Old Forester 86, I think are great in terms of just trying to get used to proof. I think once you're kind of in that realm of it, and maybe you're looking to buy a bottle, like maybe you've tried Old Forester 86, or maybe you've had Basil Hayden out at a bar, or whatever the case is. If you don't necessarily want to start with those two bottles, I would say something like what's sitting next to me. Maker's 46 is one of my absolute favorite ones. It's a 94 proof, so it's obviously out of that 80 range. We're now into the 90s, but I think it's overall a bourbon that brings a little bit more characteristic. It's more complex than just a typical standard Maker's Mark. And I know from Wild Turkey, a lot of people recommend Wild Turkey 101 a lot, but again, with that proof, I just don't see it. I think a Russell's Reserve 10-year is going to be a lot more approachable. The only thing that I've ever really heard from new beginners when it comes to Russell's 10-year, when their first time trying it, is the oakiness. If the oakiness of a bourbon is something that really, really turns you off, I would not start with the Russell's 10-year. I do think it's an oakier bourbon, but it's only 90 proof. So again, very approachable and one for you to try. This doesn't help the oakiness, but another bottle I would recommend would be Woodford Double Oaked. I think Woodford is a bottle that a lot of people are familiar with because of the availability. It's in a lot of bars. A lot of people are familiar with that brand, and that might have even been the bottle that kind of got you into bourbon. I think Double Oaked is just the next step for that, kind of like how Maker's 46 is the next step if Maker's was your first bottle, or whatever the case is. So again, I mean, picking a bottle for your specific situation, it can be very tough, and even making this list was very tough. I'm not by any means limiting your first bottle to this list, and I'm not saying we have to put you into this bucket and these are the only bottles you're allowed to enjoy. It's nothing like that. I just see so many posts and everything else and articles talking about beginner bourbons and your first bottle and blah, blah, blah. It's just this generic list. And it's the same bottles over and over again. And there's nothing wrong with those bottles. So I see why they're on the list. I just think you need to take into account why that person is buying that bottle and how they drink it. And I think once you have that, and maybe even listen to other bourbons that they've tried, or figure out what else you enjoy. Maybe not even bourbon. Maybe you drink another spirit. I did an event a few weeks ago and somebody told me that they like cognac, and that helped me understand where to take them. Like, Okay, now try this bottle. What about this one? And we were able to find bourbons that he really enjoyed. Maybe somebody likes stout beer. So I know some of those chocolate notes, some of those dark coffee notes, and some of those like wine or whatever it is that person enjoys outside of bourbon. If they're trying to get into bourbon, if you listen to them, you can actually figure out what they enjoy and where to go. And so that's what I try to do one-on-one. Obviously, making this video, I can't listen to everybody one-on-one, but overall, I try to think about different situations and scenarios as to why somebody is looking for a bottle. And yes, those lists of beginner bottles are nice and they're all very good bourbons. But a lot of people that are into whiskey now got started off of bottles like Basil Hayden, Bullet, Maker's Mark, Woodford Reserve, bottles like that that are just widely available. Even Jim Beam, the white label, those bottles are available everywhere. So people are able to try these multiple times out at bars or wherever. Even Crown Royal can be an entry point into bourbon as people start to understand whiskey and then start to separate the differences that, okay, so it's a bourbon, so Crown's not technically a bourbon, but I kind of like this profile, and it just starts to be an entry point for a lot of people. So I think ignoring those bottles completely and just saying you need to go over here, I just think it's foolish. All right, my rant's over. You have your bottles. If you've been into whiskey for a long time, what were your first bottles? Write a comment below and help others that are watching this video pick their first bottles. Which bottles got you into bourbon? Not which ones did you start to enjoy later on and once you started appreciating whiskey and all that stuff. Which bourbon bottles got you into bourbon? Which bottles made you want to start exploring this spirit a little bit more? Since you watched all the way to the end, you might as well like, subscribe, comment, do all the things, and even check out my Patreon link below. As always, thank you so much for all the support, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.